Our topic is World War First, which was a global war originating in Europe that lasted from 28 July 1914 to 11 November 1918. Now, we will enumerate the contents. The first event was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which was the main cause of the World War First. And the important issue areas were Kaiser Wilhelm II. World War begins from the Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassination. Western Front was an important episode of war. First Battle of the Marne is very important. World War First have given us the Eastern Front and Western Front and Russian Revolution, and America enters World War First. On the events, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the assassination has created tensions. These tensions had been brewing throughout Europe, especially in the troubled Balkan region of Southeast Europe, 5 years before World War First actually broke out. A number of alliances involving Europe and the European powers, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and other parties had existed 5 years. But political instability in the Balkans, particularly Bosnia, Serbia, and Herzegovina, threatened to destroy these agreements. The spark that ignited World War I was struck in Sarajevo, Bosnia, where Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was shot to death along with his wife, Sofia, by the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip on June 28, 1914. Princip and other nationalists were struggling to end Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia and Herzegovina. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand set off a rapidly escalating chain of events. Austria-Hungary, like many countries around the world, blamed the Serbian government for the attack and hoped to use the incident as justification for settling the question of Serbian nationalism once and for all. Kaiser Wilhelm II. Because mighty Russians supported Serbia, Austria-Hungary waited to declare war until its leaders received assurance from German leader Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany would support their cause. Austro-Hungarian leaders feared that a Russian intervention would involve Russia's ally, France, and possibly Great Britain as well. On July 5, Kaiser Wilhelm secretly pledged his support, giving Austria-Hungary a so-called carte blanche, a blank check, assurance of Germany's backing in the case of war. The dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary then sent an ultimatum to Serbia with such harsh terms as to make it almost impossible to accept. World War I begins. Convinced that Austria-Hungary was readying for war, the Serbian government ordered the Serbian army to mobilize and appeal to Russia for assistance. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the tenuous peace between Europe's great powers quickly collapsed. Within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia had lined up against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and World War I had begun. The Western Front, according to an aggressive military strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, named for its mastermind, German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen. Germany began fighting World War I on two fronts, invading France through neutral Belgium in the west and confronting Russia in the east. On August 4, 1914, German troops crossed the border into Belgium in the first battle of World War I. The Germans assaulted the heavily fortified city of Liege, used the most powerful weapons in their arsenal, enormous siege cannons, to capture the city by August 15. The Germans left death and destruction in their wake as they advanced through Belgium toward France. Shooting civilians and executing a Belgian priest they had accused of inciting civilian resistance. The First Battle of the Marne. In the First Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6 to 9, 1914, French and British forces confronted the invading German army, which had by then penetrated deep into northeastern France. Within 30 miles of Paris, the Allied troops checked the German advance and mounted a successful counterattack, driving the Germans back to north of the Aisne River. The defeat meant the end of German plans for a quick victory in France. Both sides dug into trenches, and the Western Front was setting for a hellish war of attrition that would last more than 3 years. Particularly long and costly battles in this campaign were fought at Verdun, February-December 1916, and the Battle of the Somme in July-November 1916. German and French troops suffered close to 1 million casualties in the Battle of Verdun alone. The lot of books have been written on the World War I, the bloodshed on the battlefields of the Western Front, and the difficulties its soldiers had 5 years after the fighting had ended, inspired such works of art as All Quiet on the Western Front. This is written by Eric Maria Remarque, and In Flanders Fields, written by Canadian Dr. Lieutenant Colonel John McCarry, and in the later poem, McCarry writes from the perspectives of the fallen soldiers. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Published in 1915, the poem inspired the use of the poppy as a symbol of remembrance. Visual artists like Otto Dix of Germany and British painters Wilhelm Lewis, Paul Nosch, and David Baumberg used their first-hand experience as soldiers in First World War to create their art, capturing the anguish of trench warfare and exploring the themes of technology, violence, and landscapes decimated by war. The Eastern Front on the Western Front of World War I, Russia sent forces to invade the German regions of East Prussia and Poland, but were stopped short by German or Austrian forces at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August 1914. Despite that victory, Russia's assault had forced Germany to move to cope from the Western Front to the Eastern, contributing to the German loss in the Battle of the Marne. Combined with the fierce Allied resistance in France, the ability of Russia's huge war machine to mobilize relatively quickly in the East ensured a longer, more grueling conflict instead of the quick victory Germany had hoped to win under the Schlieffen Plan. The West Germany, doomed by the Schlieffen Plan and the Russian Revolution, which was erupted in 1914 to 1916, Russia's army mounted several offensives on World War I's Eastern Front, but was unable to break through German lines. Defeat on the unbattled, combined with economic instability and the scarcity of food and other essentials, led to mounting discontent among the bulk of Russia's population, especially the poverty-stricken workers and peasants. This increased hostility was directed toward the imperial regime of Tsar Nicholas II and his unpopular German-born wife, Alexandria. Russia's simmering instability exploded in the Russian Revolution of 17, spearheaded by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which ended Tsarist rule and brought a halt to Russian participation in World War I. Russia reached an armistice with the Central Powers in early December 1917, freeing German troops to face the remaining allies on the Western Front. Now it was the time that America enters World War I. At the outbreak of fighting in 1914, the United States remained on the sidelines of the World War I, adopting the policy of neutrality favored by President Woodrow Wilson, while continuing to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. Neutrality, however, was increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of Germany's unchecked submarine aggression against neutral ships, including those carrying passengers. In 1915, Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone. German U-boats sunk several commercial and passenger vessels, including some U.S. ships. Widespread protest over the sinking by U-boat of the British Ocean liner Lusitania, traveling from New York to Liverpool, England, with hundreds of American passengers on board, in May 1915, helped turn the tide of American public opinion against Germany. In February 17, Congress passed $250 million arms appropriations bill intended to make the United States ready for war. Germany sunk 4 more U.S. merchant ships the following month, and on April 2, Woodrow Wilson appeared before Congress and called for a declaration of war against Germany. The Gallipoli campaign, World War I having effectively settled into stalemate in Europe, the Allies attempted to score a victory against the Ottoman Empire, which entered the conflict on the side of the Central Powers in late 1914. After a failed attack on the Dardanelles, the strait linking the Sea of the Marmara with the Aegean Sea, Allied forces led by British launched a large-scale land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. In April 1915, the invasion also proved a dismal failure, and in January 16, Allied forces staged a full retreat from the shores of the peninsula after suffering 250,000 casualties. On the field campaign at Gallipoli in 1916, the young Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the British Admiralty, had to resign from his command and accepted a commission with an infantry battalion in France. British-led forces also combated the Ottoman Turks in Egypt and Mesopotamia, while in northern Italy, Austrian and Italian troops faced off in a series of 12 battles along the Aisno River, located at the border between the two nations, and the Battle of Isonzo. The first Battle of the Isonzo took place in the late spring of 1915, soon after Italy's entrance into war on the Allied side. In the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, also known as the Battle of Caporito, October 1917, German reinforcements helped Austria-Hungary win a decisive victory. After Caporito, Italy's allies jumped in to offer increased assistance. British and French and later American troops arrived in the region, and the Allies began to take back the Italian front. Now the World War I was at sea. In the years before World War I, the superiority of Britain's Royal Navy was unchallenged by any other nation's fleet. But the Imperial German Navy had made substantial strides in closing the gap between the two naval powers. Germany's strength on the high seas was also aided by its lethal fleet of U-boat submarines. After the Battle of Dogger Bank in January 1915, in which the British mounted a surprise attack on German ships in the North Sea and the Dogger Bank, the German Navy chose not to confront Britain's mighty Royal Navy in a major battle for more than a year, preferring to rest the bulk of its naval strategy on its U-boats. The biggest naval engagement of World War I, the Battle of Jutland, May 1916, left British naval superiority on the North Sea intact, and Germany would make no front attempts to break an Allied naval blockade for the remainder of the war. The power of planes and the World War I. The World War I was the first major conflict to harness the power of planes, though not as impactful as the British Royal Navy or Germany's U-boats. The use of the planes in World War I presaged their later pivotal role in military conflicts around the globe. At the dawn of World War I, aviation was a relatively new field. The Wright brothers took their first sustained flight just 11 years before. In 1903, aircraft were initially used primarily for reconnaissance mission. During the First Battle of the Marne, information passed from pilots allowed the Allies to exploit weak spots in the German lines, helping the Allies to push Germany out of France. The first machine guns were successfully mounted on planes on June of 1912 in the United States, but were imperfect. If timed incorrectly, a bullet could easily destroy the propeller of the plane it came from. The Morne Saulnier L, a French plane, provided a solution. The propeller was armored with deflector wedges that prevented bullets from hitting it. The Morne Saulnier type L was used by the French, the British Royal Flying Corps, part of the Army, the British Royal Navy Air Service, and the Imperial Russian Air Service. The British Bristol Type 22 was another popular model used for both reconnaissance work and as a fighter plane. Dutch inventor Anthony Fokker improved upon the French deflection system in 1915. His interceptor synchronized the firing of the guns with the plane's propeller to avoid collisions. Though his most popular plane during World War I was the single-seat Fokker and Decker. Fokker created over 40 kinds of airplanes for the Germans. The Allies debuted the Handley Page HPO 400, the first two-engine bomber, in 1915. As aerial technology progressed, long-range heavy bombers like Germany's Gotha GV, first introduced in 1917s, were used to strike cities like London. Their speed and maneuverability proved to be far deadlier than Germany's earlier Zeppelin raids. By war's end, the Allies were producing 5 times more aircraft than the Germans. On April 1, 1918, the British created the Royal Air Force, or Royal Air Force, the first Air Force to be a separate military branch, independent from the Navy or Army. The Second Battle of the Marne, with Germany able to build up its strength on the Western Front after the armistice with Russia, Allied troops struggled to hold off another German offensive until promised reinforcements from the United States were able to arrive. On July 15, 1918, German troops launched what would become the last German offensive of the war, attacking French forces, joined by 85,000 American troops as well as some of the British Expeditionary Force. In the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allies successfully pushed back the German offensive and launched their own counter-offensive just 3 days later. After suffering massive casualties, Germany was forced to call off a planned offensive further north in the Flanders region stretching between France and Belgium, which was envisioned as Germany's best hope of victory. The Second Battle of the Marne turned the tide of war decisively and towards the Allies, who were able to regain much of France and Belgium in the months that followed. And the role of the 92nd and 93rd Divisions. By the time World War I began, there were 4 all-black regiments in the U.S. military. The 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry. All 4 regiments comprised of celebrated soldiers who fought in the Spanish-American War and American-Indian Wars and served in the American territories, but they were not deployed for overseas combat in World War I. Blacks serving alongside white soldiers on the front lines in Europe was inconceivable to the U.S. military. Instead, the first African American troops sent overseas served in segregated labor battalions, restricted to manual roles in the Army and Navy, and shut out of the Marines entirely. Their duties mostly included unloading ships, transporting materials from train depots, bases and ports, digging trenches, cooking and maintenance, removing barbed wire and inoperable equipment, and burying soldiers. Facing criticism from the black community and civil rights organizations for its quotas and treatment of African American soldiers in the war and in the war effort, the military formed 2 black combat units in 1917, the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, trained separately and inadequately in the United States. The divisions fared differently in the war. The 92nd faced criticism for their performance in the Meuse-Argonne campaign in September 1918. The 93rd Division, however, had more success. With dwindling armies, France asked America for reinforcements, and General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, sent regiments in the 93 divisions to Iowa. Since France had experience fighting alongside black soldiers from their Senegalese French colonial army, the 93 divisions 369 Regiment, nicknamed the Harrium Hellfighters, fought so gallantly with a total of 191 days on the front lines, longer than any AEF regiments, that France awarded them the Croix de Guerre for their heroism. More than 350,000 African American soldiers would serve in World War I in various capacities. Toward armistice, by the fall of 1918, the Central Powers were unraveling on all fronts, despite Turkish victory at Gallipoli. Later defeats by invading forces and an Arab revolt that destroyed the Ottoman economy and devastated its land, and the Turks signed a treaty with the Allies in late October 1918. Austria-Hungary, dissolving from within due to growing nationalist movements among its diverse population, reached an armistice on November 4. Facing dwindling resources in the battlefield, discontent on the home front, and the surrender of its allies, Germany was finally forced to seek an armistice on November 11, 1918, ending World War I. Now the Treaty of Versailles. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Allied leaders stated their desires to build a post-war world that would safeguard itself against future conflicts of such devastating scale. Some hopeful participants had even begun calling World War I the war to end all wars. but the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, would not achieve that lofty goal. Saddled with war guilt, heavy reparations, and denied entrance into the League of Nations, Germany felt tricked into singing, and in the signing the treaty, having believed any peace would be a peace without victory, as put forward by President Wilson in his famous 14-point speech of January 1918. As the years passed, hatred of the Versailles Treaty and its authors settled into a smoldering resentment in Germany that would, 2 decades later, be counted among the causes of World War II. Now the World War I casualties. World War I took the lives of more than 9 million soldiers. 21 million more were wounded. Civilian casualties numbered close to 10 million. The 2 nations most affected were Germany and France, each of which sent some 80% of their male populations between the ages of 15 and 49 into battle. The perilous but critical role of World War I runners. The political disruption surrounding World War I also contributed to the fall of 4 venerable imperial dynasties: Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Turkey. The legacy of the World War I brought about massive social upheaval as millions of women entered the workforce to replace men who went to war and those who never came back. The First Global War also helped to spread one of the world's deadliest global pandemics, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, which killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people. World War I has also been referred to as the first modern war. Many of the technologies now associated with military conflict, machine guns, tanks, aerial combat, and radio communications, were introduced on a massive scale during World War I. The several effects that chemical weapons such as mustard gas and phosgene had on soldiers and civilians during World War I galvanized public and military attitudes against their continued use. The Geneva Convention agreements signed in 1925 restricted the use of chemical and biological agents in warfare and remains in effect today. What was the main point of the World War I? All the countries had territorial aims: to evacuate the Germans from Belgium, to restore Alsace-Lorraine to France, for Italy to get the Trentino, and so on. They also wanted to restore their defeated allies, Serbia and Romania, ideally with extra territory. Why the German forces started war? The war was started by the leaders of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Vienna seized the opportunity presented by the assassination of the Archduke to attempt to destroy its Balkan rival Serbia. Germany gave Austria unconditional support to its actions, again fully aware of the likely consequences. According to some analysts, who was at fault for World War I? As every schoolboy should know, it was the militant Serbian nationalist who assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Austro-Hungarian prince, whose killing led to his nation's declaration of war on Serbia, which had a domino effect as other countries entering the conflict. America has used African American soldiers in the First World War, and Germany is blamed for World War I only for starting it because they were the first country to declare war before any other country. So overall, Germany did not only start the war, but they also influenced another country that was a part of their alliance, Austria-Hungary, to fight with another country, Serbia. Britain is also responsible for World War I because Britain is blamed for causing World War I because that had it not been for its declaration of war to Germany, what started as a local dispute involving Austria-Hungary and Serbia could have remained local as instead of involving war between all major powers. What changes have been carried phenomenally after World War I? As can be the case following conflict between countries, World War I resulted in the political map of Europe being reshaped under the Treaty of Versailles, which was drawn up after the war to essentially decide what would happen next. Germany lost about a tenth of its lands. And why the Germany declared war on England during the World War I? The Germans wanted the British government to ignore the Treaty of London and let the German army pass through Belgium. In the end, Britain refused to ignore the events of 4 August 1914 when Germany attacked France through Belgium. Within hours, Britain declared war on Germany. What did America gain from World War I? In addition, the conflict heralded the rise of conscription, mass propaganda, the National Security State, and the FBI, Federal Bureau of Intelligence. It accelerated income tax and urbanization and helped make America the preeminent economic and military power in the world. And how did World War I affect the U.S. economy? The World War I took the United States out of a recession into a 44-month economic boom. 30 before the war, America had been a debtor nation. After the war, it became a lender, especially to Latin America. U.S. exports to Europe increased as those countries geared up for war. And how affect the World War I the USA? America's involvement in World War II had a significant impact on the economy and workforce of the United States. Our involvement, Americans say, in the war soon changed that rate. American factories were retooled to produce goods to support the war effort, and almost overnight the unemployment rate dropped to around 10%. Though the war was an enterprise for America and a political and strategic business that was being fought in the European continent, and America was totally restricted and its security was totally safe and sound, and that was intact. The impacts of World War I on Russia at the World War I was to having a devastating impact on Russia. When World War I started in August 14, Russia responded by patriotically rallying around Nicholas II. Military disasters at the Masurian Lakes and Tannenberg greatly weakened the Russian army in the initial phases of the war. Most of the historians agree that the World War I played a crucial role in bringing down the regime in February 1917. The military failures, despite initial popularity of Russia, the war amongst the Russian people, and the increased patriotic support for the Tsar, and the heavy military defeats and huge death tolls in 1914 and 15 led to disillusion and anger at the way the war was being conducted. Nicholas II worsened the situation by assuming control of the Russian army at the front from September 1915, making him personally responsible for future military defeats, and leaving the Tsarina and Rasputin in Petrograd. The role of the Tsarina and Rasputin, left in charge of the government, these two decreased support for Tsarism further by making such a horrible job in charge, dismissing competent ministers and replacing them with incompetent ones. This led to chaos and worsening conditions in the cities. Powerful opponents mocked those two, and the Tsar was blamed for leaving them in charge. Even though Rasputin was murdered by a loyalist in 1916, who hoped thus to reduce the damage being done to the Tsar's reputation, it was too late. Support to Nicholas from the army and higher levels of society faded away, leaving few prepared to defend him in 1917. failure to make political reforms, allowing the progressive bloc of discontented liberals a greater role in running the country, might have helped ease the pressure on Nicholas II and for Russia to have become a constitutional monarchy. However, Nicholas' dogmatic devotion to autocracy meant that he refused to allow a greater role for representative bodies, leaving himself to answer for the condition of Russia personally. His refusal to compromise on his autocratic principles contributed importantly to his downfall in February 1917. Impact of war on living conditions. Eventual collapse of the Tsardom in 1917, not caused ultimately by ideology or political ideas, but by the desperate suffering experienced by the Russian people as a result of World War I. War caused huge distress, as there was a shortage of food, fuel and goods, as well as high prices, inflation and worker unemployment. Urban workers were hostile to the Tsar's regime, while peasants were angry about the loss of young men at the front. The more we will discuss in the second lecture on World War I and the impact and revolution of 1917 October in Russia.